Have you ever wondered why, out of every human who has ever lived, most of us have spent our lives obeying someone else? Not because they were stronger, not because they could outrun us or outfight us, but because, somewhere along the way, we agreed to believe they were different from the rest of us. Special, chosen, almost divine. It seems ordinary now. Presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, a chain of command that most people never question. But for the vast majority of human history, nobody bowed to anybody. For nearly 200,000 years, our ancestors lived in small bands with no rulers at all. No thrones, no crowns, no one whose word was law. So how did we get from that world to this one? How did a species built on equality invent the king? The strange thing is, the answer doesn't begin with a conqueror or a tyrant. It begins with food. For most of human existence, people lived as hunter-gatherers, moving in small, mobile groups of maybe 25 to 50 people. In a world like that, hierarchy is almost impossible to sustain. If one person tried to boss everyone else around, the group could simply walk away. There was no surplus to control, no stored wealth to hoard, nothing to fight over that couldn't be replaced by moving to the next valley. Anthropologists who have studied surviving hunter-gatherer societies describe them as fiercely egalitarian, sometimes even actively punishing anyone who got too full of themselves. Bragging, bossiness, hoarding, these were social sins. The group had ways of cutting an aspiring big shot down to size through mockery, gossip, or simply ignoring him. So something had to change before kings could exist, and that something was the ability to produce more food than people could eat in a day. Around 10,000 years ago, in scattered pockets across the globe, humans began to farm. And farming did something hunting and gathering never could. It created surplus, grain that could be harvested, dried, and stored. Suddenly, for the first time, there was something worth guarding, something worth controlling, something one person could take from another. And with surplus came a brand new problem. Who gets to decide how it's shared? In small farming villages, this question was often solved informally, through a figure anthropologists call the big man. Not a king, not yet, but someone who had worked harder, farmed smarter, or simply gathered more than his neighbors. He didn't rule by force, he ruled by generosity. He would host massive feasts, give away pigs, food, or tools, and in return, people owed him something intangible but powerful: obligation, loyalty, status. It seems almost backwards. The first steps toward kingship weren't about taking, they were about giving. But giving on a scale no one could match creates a debt no one can fully repay. And debt, it turns out, is one of the oldest forms of power humans ever invented. As villages grew into towns and towns grew into small cities, something else began to happen. Surplus needed protection, grain stores needed defending from raiders, and increasingly from rival villages doing exactly the same thing. Communities that could organize quickly under a single leader in times of danger tended to survive. Communities that argued and debated during a crisis often didn't. So warfare, as brutal as it sounds, may have quietly favored the rise of centralized authority. A chief who could rally warriors fast became more than useful. He became necessary. But military leadership alone doesn't explain the leap to kingship, because a war chief's power usually faded once the fighting stopped. For authority to become permanent, it needed something even more persuasive than fear. It needed belief. This is where religion enters the story, and where the idea of a king begins to feel less like a job and more like a myth. In many of the earliest complex societies, the person who organized food storage, mediated between families, and led during crises also began to take on a spiritual role. They performed the rituals believed to keep the harvest safe, to please the ancestors, to ensure the rains came on time. And once a leader is seen as the one who keeps the gods happy, disobeying him stops being a political choice and starts to feel like a cosmic risk. In ancient Mesopotamia, in the city of Uruk around 5,000 years ago, this fusion of political and religious authority reached a striking new scale. Uruk had grown into what may have been the largest city on Earth at the time, and it needed something no small village ever had: a way to track who owned what, who owed what, and who had paid their share. This need for record-keeping is part of what pushed humans toward one of the most consequential inventions in our history: writing. And notice what the earliest written symbols were actually used for. Not poetry, not stories, grain counts, tax records, debts. The first written words in human history were largely the fingerprints of emerging power, the bureaucracy of kingship being born in clay. Around the same time, in Egypt, a similar transformation was unfolding along the Nile. Small farming communities dependent on the river's predictable floods gradually merged into larger and larger political units until, according to Egyptian tradition, a single ruler unified Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. That ruler wasn't just a leader, he was declared a living link between the human world and the divine one, a god walking among mortals, responsible for the flooding of the Nile itself. This is the moment the idea of the king truly crystallizes. Not simply the strongest person in the room, but a figure believed to stand between ordinary people and the forces that controlled life and death. Rain, harvest, war, the favor of the gods. If you controlled the story of who could speak to those forces, you controlled everything else by extension. And once that belief took hold, kingship no longer needed to be re-earned through generosity or bravery every generation. It could simply be inherited. A son could claim his father's divine connection without ever proving himself in battle or in the fields. Power, once tied to personal merit, became tied to bloodline. The crown replaced the feast. What's remarkable is that this same pattern, surplus, obligation, protection, belief, and finally inheritance, appears again and again in unconnected corners of the world. In the river valleys of the Indus, in early China along the Yellow River, in the highland kingdoms of the Andes. Different peoples, different gods, different landscapes, arriving at a strikingly similar solution to the same underlying problem. How do you organize thousands of strangers who will never all meet face to face? Because that's really what a king was in the end. Not just a ruler, but a story large enough to hold a society together. A shared belief that let people who had never met, who spoke different dialects, who lived their entire lives without ever seeing their leader in person, still act as one. Long after the granaries were empty and the floods had come and gone, it was the idea of the king, more than the man himself, that kept the whole fragile system from falling apart. And maybe that's the realization worth sitting with. We didn't invent kings because we were conquered into obedience. We invented them because once our numbers grew too large for everyone to simply talk it out, we needed something to believe in together. The crown was never really about one extraordinary person. It was about the rest of us and how far we were willing to stretch our trust to hold a civilization together.